Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Football Outsiders Fantasy Show. I'm your host, Scott Spratt. Whether you're listening to us live at twitch.tv/FB Outsiders every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, or hearing us on the Football Outsiders Podcast Network, thanks for joining us. Today, I have Scott Barrett from Fantasy Points joining, so we've got some really good stuff to talk about, kind of centered on interesting carry and target splits for running backs heading into your drafts for this year. But Scott, let's start with just how are you, man? Good to see you. It's been a while since I've had a chance to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
Absolutely. And before we get too deep into the nitty gritty of today's show, since we're kind of in camp time, preseason games are kicking off, I wanted to round up some of the news that I found that I thought might be fantasy relevant. And I'd say, Scott, your mileage may vary on how important some of these revelations are, but things that I thought might be worth discussing. So let's kick a few of those off the top. Starting with the Falcons signing running back Dante Foreman. Foreman is somebody that was once a third-round pick. I think that might have been 2017. And so he had a lot of fantasy promise before he tore his Achilles several years ago. Hasn't really worked out so far for him in his career. And I think the assumption would be that he's just going to be kind of a depth signing for this team without a lot of depth. But given that Mike Davis has never entered a year as sort of a presumed bell cow back, I wanted to get your thoughts. Do you think that Foreman matters in fantasy, and does it affect Mike Davis at all?
No, I don't think it really matters. I mean, Foreman had an all-time great speed score at his pro day, but yeah, like you said, the Achilles injury, that's brutal. It's really tough to come back from. 29 carries over the past 3 seasons. So he individually doesn't really matter too much to me, or I'm not too concerned with him. What does bother me with Mike Davis, because you look at him, you look at that backfield, and the competition really isn't too great. But Arthur Smith, the head coach, basically came out and said a month or so ago, we don't have a Derrick Henry here. You'd love to have that. We don't have that. So we're going to have to go with a more of a committee approach, use our multiple backs. And so, reading that, to me, bump him down. I don't think he has the bell cow upside that, a Myles Gaskin might, where just at least the coaches aren't coming out and saying it's going to be a committee approach.
The tricky thing about it, though, is that Foreman, I think you mentioned, what's he up to, 118 career touches, ever in his career? Mm-hmm. That's still by far the most behind Davis. Quadri Olison, less than 50. You've got 2 undrafted rookies in Javian Hawkins and Caleb Huntley, and then Cordarrelle Patterson, who I guess, to be fair, he has more touches, but he is a kick returner primarily and sort of a wide receiver too. So it's hard to come up with guys to split time with Davis. I don't know. I'm just not sure that this running situation may be great. I like Davis, but it's not ideal.
Yeah, I mean, it's also early in the offseason too. No one expected Le'Veon Bell to get cut by the Jets and wind up with the Chiefs, or Leonard Fournette to get cut by the Jaguars and wind up with the Buccaneers. So, who knows? There might be some surprise cuts along those lines, and some more increased competition for Mike Davis.
Okay, news item number 2. Mecole Hardman opened with the Chiefs' first official depth chart coming out, is listed as the number 2 wide receiver. I don't know if you care about that, but he's currently just the 53rd wide receiver in ESPN ADP. So, Scott, do you think that Hardman is going too late in drafts right now?
Yeah, I think so. I think probably. I mean, just what's his upside? What's his standalone value as the number 3 receiver on the team? That's pretty valuable, I think. And then what's his upside if there were to be an injury to Tyreek Hill or Travis Kelce? I think that's
massive.
Right.
Yeah. So I think Hardman in his career so far, 2 seasons, 2.21 fantasy points per target. That's the 3rd highest among wide receivers with 75 or more targets, just behind A.J. Brown and Adam Thielen. So at least based on his previous career usage, the upside really seems tremendous. But I don't know how much of that is related to the fact that if he is coming in as sort of the 4th or 5th option on a play, that may be dictating what sort of coverage options teams have against him or anything. I don't know. Do you think Hardman has that type of peak top 10 upside?
Yeah, I don't know. Probably not. But I mean, it's Patrick Mahomes, so anything's possible.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. Okay, another receiver, another AFC West team, Brian Edwards with the Raiders. He's actually consistently been practicing with the first team offense ahead of John Brown, the free agent addition that I think we thought was going to replace Nelson Aguilar. Though I'll remind everybody, he had 82 targets last season, so it was actually quite productive from a fantasy perspective for your deeper formats. Edwards is going super late in drafts right now, number 72 in wide receivers among ESPN and ADP. So, Scott, do you think that Edwards is an attractive sleeper, or maybe is this news more important related to what you think of Henry Ruggs this season?
Well, I really don't like Henry Ruggs too much. And I do like Brian Edwards. So my wide receiver model last year had Ruggs as like the 15th best wide receiver in this class. And it had Edwards as like the 4th or 5th best wide receiver in the class.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's not just like, super penalizing the hyper efficient low target guys because, my model loved Jalen Waddle this past off season. But yeah, so definitely like Edwards, hope to believe in his talent. And, John Gruden coming out and saying he's the next Terrell Owens or whatever he said, that definitely perks my ears up a little bit. The immediate reaction from fantasy analysts and fantasy owners is like, like coaches lie all the time. It's just coach speak, it's BS. I don't know. I don't know, because 2 years ago, trusting John Gruden paid dividends. He told us Darren Waller was going to be his tight end one, was going to be given the chance of a lifetime. He said Darren Waller was, one of the biggest hidden gems in all of the NFL. And what happened? I mean, he absolutely smashed and he had a breakout season. So
yeah,
wouldn't shock me if Brian Edwards was next up. And what's going on with Darren Waller? He hasn't practiced in like 8 days and no one has a reason why, right?
I saw that. There are a handful of other sort of preseason storylines, like Hunter Henry injured his shoulder for the Patriots. And I've been focusing on the ones that I thought were spilling into the regular season. But to be frank, I don't really know what's going on with Darren Waller right now. And so that could be huge, obviously, for his own fantasy value, but what it could mean for the other Raiders receivers. Scott, let me ask you a little bit about your model then, because this is kind of the first time hearing of this. For people listening or watching that don't remember, same draft as Henry Ruggs, Edwards goes in the 3rd round of the Raiders. So that you would think that would say something about the preferences of the two players. But Edwards definitely, at least from a scouting perspective, seems like the more versatile player in that at 6'3", 212 pounds, kind of has the height, weight, speed of a top tier wide receiver, whereas Ruggs may be a little bit more skewed towards, explosive plays down the field or maybe catch and run opportunities or like a more narrow route tree. Is that kind of the difference you're seeing here? Or are there other reasons why your model really prefers Edwards over Ruggs?
Yeah. So this is my, let's say pre-combine version of the model. Then once you factor in the combine, you give Ruggs a bump up. And then once you factor in like a slight, the combine's super overrated. And then when you factor in draft capital, Ruggs gets a bigger bump up. But just like looking at all of the most important efficiency metrics and I guess counting stats and other advanced stats, the most important to me or the stickiest or the most predictive, Ruggs just, did not stand out in a good way. And I'm predicting fantasy points with my model. So being a possession receiver, that's going to be valuable. Some would argue his elite speed, just being there as a deep threat to keep the defense on their toes, that brings incredible value to an NFL offense, but much less so, fantasy points, which granted, but definitely wasn't a big Ruggs fan. This past offseason, I had Jamar Chase as like maybe the best wide receiver prospect to come out in 7 years. Devonta Smith was right behind him. And then my guy, Elijah Moore, was right behind those two, but still ranking as like a top 7 prospect over the top 7 seasons, the past 7 seasons. So like definitely a high level quality prospect. And this was like a stacked, really good wide receiver class. Jalen Waddle was, right up there as like really the very rich man's Henry Ruggs to me.
I mean, I think Waddle definitely did more at Alabama than Ruggs did, right? I mean, Ruggs was kind of classically small volume of targets at Alabama before getting to be the number one drafted wide receiver in his class. But I don't know. That's interesting. And then for one last preseason storyline note for you, another receiver that was in that class, although not drafted actually, Marquez Calloway of the Saints. According to Jeff Duncan of NOLA.com, he's been kind of the breakout star of training camp for whatever that's worth. But I'm wondering if it's worth a lot because Michael Thomas, depending on whether you believe sort of the Saints brass, he kind of was ignoring the team through a lot of the early offseason and got his ankle surgery very late in June, which then is going to bump him later into this season, probably going to miss at least 3 or 4 weeks. So suddenly the Saints don't really have a number one receiver. Could Callaway be that guy, do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I think so. I draft him over Traquan. He's a Greg Cosell favorite, so he's certainly the one I gravitate towards. What's going on with the Saints offense is sort of tricky and confusing, and it's hard to predict, who's going to be the starting quarterback. I think, the Michael Thomas news should, give the slight edge to Taysom just because, what he can bring on the ground, that added dimension with the poor receiving core. And then I think, Kamara is going to get his targets no matter what. He's their best receiver with Thomas out, and then Troutman, and then probably Callaway and Traquan. I don't know that he's going to be a guy you feel great about starting, every week or in any given week, but he's definitely, I'd say probably the favorite for the best pick at value right now.
Well, I mean, the value, he's going undrafted in ESPN ADP right now, which that ADP, it hasn't been that long since we've really figured out Michael Thomas's sort of prognosis here. So maybe it's going to catch up to that a little bit, but in your deeper formats, that may be a really, really good deep sleeper that you can go after, even deeper than Bryan Edwards, for example. So that's good. Scott, before we get into the actual meat of the day's show, I'll mention that Corvos on Twitch, he subscribed at a tier 1 for us. Thank you very much. We appreciate your support. And then getting into the main topic of the day's show, interesting carry and target splits for running backs. This is focused on some Football Outsiders reports that are going to go up on Football Outsiders Plus, FO Plus. So please subscribe to that. These aren't up quite yet, the way that the last ones were from the previous shows, but we'll let you know when they are up for you. But basically, they're going to give you ability to do sort of overtime splits and other situational splits here to look at carries and targets and, how much of a share are players getting, how many, carries per snap, all kinds of things like that. So we're going to kind of dig into a few examples of fun things that you can learn from that, starting with Myles Gaskin, the presumed starter for the Dolphins right now, who actually played a really high 68.8% of Dolphins snaps last year in the 10 games when he was healthy. That only trailed these players, Scott: Christian McCaffrey, David Johnson, David Montgomery, Ezekiel Elliott, Miles Sanders, Dalvin Cook, and James Robinson. They were actually ahead of guys like Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, and Joe Mixon, among many others. So it's a really heavy volume there. You're getting the 4.7 targets per game, top 10 in his position. Do you think that Gaskin can be a bell cow back, or has at least that potential to be, such that, maybe that should force his way into the top 20 in ADP at the position where he's not quite going just yet?
Yeah, of course he has that potential. That's exactly what we saw last season from week 5 on until the end of the year. He averaged 15.7 carries and 4.5 targets per game. He averaged 19.7 fantasy points per game, 18.0 expected fantasy points per game, and a 69% snap share. Only 7 running backs had a higher snap share. Only 4 saw better volume. Only 3 averaged more fantasy points per game over the full season. So yeah, you're looking at, RB4 production, RB5 volume, and he's going RB 24 by.
Yeah, 21 in ESPN ADP that I saw. That it may not be 100% accurate, but not in the top 20.
Yeah, that's crazy. So, the upside is clearly there. It's, RB5 at, who he was last year when he was healthy, or, maybe more realistically, like low end RB1 at, a high end RB3, a low end RB2 ADP. So I think the risk is more than baked in, and I think he's a great pick in drafts.
So I'm a little bit of a mixed mind here because he's a little bit small. He's 5'10" and 210 pounds, which slots him in at a 28.7 BMI. I know we're getting a little bit dorky with that, but by and large, the backs that are bell cow backs are usually between 29 and 31 BMI. 28.7 would definitely be on the low end. But as sort of a counterpoint to that, Gaskin had 2.40 yards after the catch plus. It's the best among running backs with 30 plus targets. So I mean, I almost don't even care if he's taking all the between the tackles work for the team. If he's going to be so active as a receiver, then maybe he can Alvin Kamara his way to a really big number. Although worth pointing out that Kamara actually is dramatically bigger than Gaskin, even though we don't sort of think of him that way. Like, do you have any size related thoughts for Gaskin?
No, I think that matters. But it really matters just in terms of what the coaches think. And if they think a guy can handle or withstand that level of volume. And we saw last year, it seemed they thought he did whenever he was healthy. They gave him that work. Maybe, he couldn't stay healthy and they're going to take it away from him, force a committee. But it's sort of like Mike Davis, where, we've seen it with this same coaching staff.
Yeah.
So that's like a big edge to him. And then the competition feels similar to me. I mean, like Malcolm Brown doesn't scare me. Salvin Ahmed doesn't scare me. And yeah,
they're thin. I mean, both the Dolphins and the Falcons, they were probably the top two teams that everybody was surprised didn't draft a running back. But I guess, once you got the Javonte Williams, who went really early in the second round, those teams kind of lost their chance to swing at those guys. It just wasn't quite the same depth of the class this season. So that's
he went the pick right in front of them. They were going to take Javonte
that's who they would have taken, don't you bet?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm projecting, but that seemed like that would have been a good fit.
The reporters or, insiders, quote unquote, have said that they were going to take Javonte, but they got sniped on the trade.
Yeah. Well, I mean, good news potentially for Gaskin's fantasy value. I guess we will see. Okay, Philip, throw up the graphic here. We're going to talk a little bit about carries per snap leaders from last season, and there are a number of guys here that are pretty interesting. If you're looking at the table up on Twitch, like you'll see a lot of the guys you're probably expecting. I played around a little bit with the qualifiers here, so you also see some Jordan Howard types, but also players like, Derrick Henry, Cam Akers. These guys were definite leaders, Dalvin Cook in carries per snap. But the guy that actually led the league with a minimum of 6 games last year was Damian Harris, who took a carry on 55% of snaps. Again, that's the highest among running backs with 6+ games played. And I think we've all been a little bit nervous of Harris's fantasy value, even though we sort of see him as being, a very effective real life runner. 9.9% rushing DVOA last season, was top 20 at the position. But you're worried about, is he going to score touchdowns? You're worried that, he only had a handful of targets last season. Is he not going to get the sort of important types of touches for fantasy production? But seeing him up here in this sort of Derrick Henry level of touching when he's on the field, does that give you more confidence that he can be, a fantasy worthy running back?
Yeah, I mean, well, 250 snaps in 10 games, that's not great. And then, in fantasy football and PPR leagues, a carry is worth 2.64 times. A target is worth 2.64 times as much as a carry in PPR leagues. Outside of the red zone, 3.1 times as much. So that it really is so much more valuable. And if you're not getting that passing work, you're going to be very game script sensitive.
True.
Very week to week volatile, which is frustrating in a start sit league. That's fine in a best ball league. And with Damian Harris specifically, you're hoping Cam Newton is not going to be in the picture for long, vulturing those rushing touchdowns. But at the end of the day, I mean, I could see him being, maybe maybe a poor man's J.K. Dobbins, something along those lines.
Okay.
Where good efficiency, I guess like LeGarrette Blount from the days of old, where in games New England wins by 10 or more points, he's going to score 16 fantasy points, let's say, and then all other games he's going to score like 11 or something along those lines. But he's not going to be in a lot of my start sit PPR leagues, but I think he's a solid best ball pick.
So what I think the thing you said about Cam Newton is kind of the most interesting point here, which is that given that Cam takes so many of the carries near the goal line and scores those touchdowns, Harris's ADP is not very high because you're like, he's, again, not getting catches, presumably, probably not getting a lot of touchdowns. But when the team moves to Mac Jones, that really, I feel like, opens the door for him to potentially score a lot more touchdowns. Do you think that's going to happen at some point this season? And does that sort of change your perspective, knowing that maybe in the fantasy playoffs, when you might want Harris the most, that may be when he suddenly is a sort of a flex worthy or maybe back in top 20 running back, maybe not in PPR leagues, but in standard formats?
Yeah, again, I'm not really drafting him in a start sit league because I'm drafting my running backs early. I'm going RB to start, or I'm going RB. And like, I don't really care about Damian Harris. Like you just said, like his upside would be, a flex play or, low end RB2, but like, that's not at all valuable for fantasy. Like to me, a low end RB2 is like fairly worthless. I talk about this in Upside Wins Championships. I talk about this in Anatomy of a League Winner. There's like very few players who actually matter for fantasy, and like a low end RB2 is fairly worthless. Like that's not at all, helping your team actually win games. But yeah, again, in a best ball, that would have really good value where you get all of those spike games, those games where, New England wins. He has good game script. He scores a couple touchdowns. And you don't ever have to predict starting that. You just get all the good without the bad. And so New England's offense, I think, Mac Jones coming in would be massive to a number of players, just because like, if you look at Cam Newton's numbers last year, he was Tim Tebow. He was like identical to Tim Tebow. And that's not good for his receivers and the running backs. Yeah, vultured the rushing touchdowns, get him out of the picture. That's definitely good news for Damian Harris. And then Mac Jones coming in would be really good news for one of my most drafted players, Jacoby Myers. Also have a good amount of Nelson Aguilar, Jonnu Smith too. Jacoby Myers, though, I'll just make my little pitch on him. So after the Julian Edelman injury, when he came in, became the starting slot wide receiver. Yeah. So like week 7 until the end of the regular season, he ranks second among all players in receiving yardage market share. And you know how good that stat is, how predictive that stat is. And it's just like no one could tell because like it was such a bad, low volume pass offense. But I mean, like he was sandwiched in between like AJ Brown and or Devontae Adams and AJ Brown. So high potential. You got to get Cam Newton out of the picture.
Yeah. So kind of, again, piggybacking on that thought, like, are we sure that Damian Harris doesn't have any receiving upside? Like he caught the ball a little bit in college. He also is sort of a, elusive type player that, if you would just looked at, say, his combine measurements in his times, you would assume that he would be a little bit more versatile of a player than he was in his first year. Is that something that might change if Mac Jones was the starter too?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. He has five catches last year, nothing 5 the year before. And it just seems like Belichick prefers to go this route where he has the guy who just runs the ball. And then he has his little scat back and James White. Sony Michel was an accomplished pass catcher in college. I don't know if LeGarrette Blount was, but he certainly didn't catch passes with the Patriots. So it just seems like a sort of, these are their roles, and that's the way Belichick likes it.
Okay. Well, a couple other deep names from this carries per snap leaderboard, which I'll see if I can pique your interest as a player, a little bit more interested in drafting the top guys. But AJ Dillon of the Packers, Jamal Williams is gone now in Detroit. He's vacating 150 touches. Do you think Dillon is just kind of replaced that, and that's kind of what you're dealing with, and not much more than a flex consideration? Or do you think that Dillon maybe has more potential?
Yeah. So I was doing my rankings for Aaron Jones, and I kept I didn't expect it to be the case, but it was like really one I struggled with. I just kept waffling back and forth. Do I put him, RB8 or do I put him whatever? And something that just stuck out in my mind was, what was it? Week 16 last year. Mm-hmm. Aaron Jones saw 10 carries and 3 targets. AJ Dillon saw 21 carries and 1 target. And granted, it was a blowout, but even if you just look at the first half, Dillon only saw 1 fewer target while still out carrying Jones 10-4. And it's crap. Is there a case that LaFleur just really, really loves AJ Dillon and wants to get him, around 16 carries per game?
Yeah,
I think it's possible. But I don't think it's too likely. I think Aaron Jones is just going to continue to be sort of inexplicably capped at like 60% of the team snaps. AJ Williams actually Jamal Williams doesn't leave behind a ton of volume in terms of like touches, but he leaves behind a significant amount of volume in terms of snaps. He had a lot of empty snaps for whatever reason. You have to think if those go to Jones, like those snaps shouldn't be so empty. But yeah, I see like maybe 10 to 14 carries and 0.5 target, maybe one target per game for AJ Dillon, which could be valuable. It definitely could be. That's definitely, again, like low end RB2s are fairly worthless to me in start sit leagues. So I'm avoiding him in start sit leagues, but he could be a surpriser. He's just like not the archetype I gravitate towards, which is a guy who's going to get maybe 15% of the backfield targets and 50 to 55% of the rushing attempts, but only, 40% of the snaps or what have you. That's where I'm at with the AJ Dillon.
I think I can explain the weird Jamal Williams empty snaps by some measurements, and I can't think offhand of which one I'm talking about, but I've seen him where he's been ranked number one in pass blocking among running backs. And that is something that's a clear weakness in Aaron Jones's game. And I don't really have a strong opinion about how good AJ Dillon is as a pass protector yet. And honestly, that may kind of make or break his value. But if you can assume that may be something he's good at, that could be something that's bringing him onto the field, even though he doesn't necessarily have the versatility that Jones does. Meanwhile, I'll also point out that the Packers ran on just 18 of 48 plays within 5 yards of the end zone last year, 37.5%. Only the Jaguars were with them under 45%. So like way lower than everybody else in the league. Finally, AJ Dillon, 3.20 yards after contact per attempt, led all backs with, again, a small volume of carries, but he's a power back. The Packers didn't run a lot near the red zone, but could. It seems like he would be the guy that would benefit from that. And if he can block, then I think that, that's a potential for him to have sort of even bigger role than Jamal Williams had, which could lead to some fantasy value, even while Aaron Jones is being successful.
Yeah, I mean, they also just gave Aaron Jones all this money.
They did.
So I really do think they're just going to stick with him as being their guy. I mean, if AJ Dillon gets all the goal line work, that would be massive. I also don't know if that I see that happening, just because Aaron Jones has been one of the most efficient 10 zone runners for the past few seasons. He saw 23 opportunities inside the 10-yard line last year. Dillon only saw 2. But yeah, I typically don't grab the RB2 in a two-way running back by committee unless it's at a significant discount. He does have, sky high injury upside if Aaron Jones should suffer an injury, but I don't see it as being as high as Latavius Murray, who I think has some standalone value as well, or similar standalone value. Because, if Alvin Kamara goes down, he has top 5 upside. I think if Aaron Jones suffers an injury, I still don't know if AJ Dillon's catching passes, but the 2 games Kamara missed 2 years ago, Latavius Murray averaged like 22 carries, 9 targets per game, and 33 fantasy points per game. So I'm typically drafting him. I just don't think that, the extra 3 carries for AJ Dillon in comparison to Latavius Murray is worth it, but I think he's a fine pick.
So with your Latavius Murray belief, does that hinge on whether or not Taysom Hill or Jameis is the starter?
Yeah, for standalone value, I think it's going to be better for him if Taysom starts. His 3 highest snap games all came with Taysom under center. He saw different usage, like a different sort of somewhat expanded role. I'm not really drafting either. Again, I go quality over quantity. I get my running backs early. I tend not to throw these darts at these sort of running backs where you're hoping someone in front of them gets injured. I really want those bell cows. I really want those running backs with high end, mid range RB1 upside. So that's just my draft philosophy. You can read the bell cow or bust. That's my running back strategy. You can read the bell cow report where I go into this, but that's where I stand.
Well, then I've got the perfect player for you, and I'm definitely being sarcastic here. The third player that I wanted to bring up along these lines is Tevin Coleman of the Jets, a player that didn't play a lot last year, had several injuries that limited his ability to, but he did have one game with double-digit snaps. That was week 2. He played 30 snaps for the 49ers that week, had 14 carries and 2 targets, and has been a very effective player on a somewhat limited number of touches throughout a lot of his career. He's joined the Jets with Robert Saleh, also heading over from the 49ers. And so do you think that Coleman has any potential value here, or is Saleh maybe bringing him in as sort of a mentor to a very young backfield and one that wouldn't be as experienced with his personal system?
Yeah, early on when I was drafting best ball leagues, I was a little surprised by Tevin Coleman's ADP, which was, basically undrafted or super low. Because I was projecting, at least 60% of the rushing work to go to Tevin Coleman. But we have an NFL insider on our staff over at fantasypoints.com. Mm-hmm. And, the news or reports we've heard regarding Tevin Coleman have not been good. Basically, it was, hey, he's an interesting best ball guy. I wouldn't draft him. Yeah. And Michael Carter is, another, to me, very mispriced guy. Very safe. I guarantee you he's going to beat his ADP. That's a lock. And then what's his upside? I don't know. I think he has pretty decent upside. He's already playing exclusively with the ones. I think he's the RB1. And so it's just a matter of, he's definitely going to lead the backfield in targets. And that's important for a team that's not good, bottom 5 defense. They're going to trailing a lot. They're going to have to lean pass heavy. And that's his game. He was a very good pass catcher in college. And then, so what does he get in terms of rushing work? Maybe, 40, 50, 60%. I think, that's a more valuable role as the RB1 on this team than people realize. I think he has good upside. I think he's, a great value at ADP. Tevin Coleman, again, best ball, it's fine, whatever. I'm not doing that, but you could do that. But Carter, yeah, he's more of a target.
Yeah, I think if you're not paying close enough attention to some of the preseason stuff, you can get thrown off the scent with Carter, which is, I think, maybe why his ADP isn't on the rise as much as you'd expect. With the Jets' initial depth chart coming out, I think they listed Carter as the number 4 running back, which I think is just like Robert Saleh is an old school guy. He's like, this is the rookie. He's going to have to earn his way. But like your NFL insider is suggesting over fantasy points, it's like he's getting a lot of the work with the ones. All accounts are that he looks like the most successful player so far in camp. And you would think he's the most talented, assuming that Coleman is probably past his physical prime. Guys like LaMichael Perrin, have had a chance. They haven't really done much so far in the league. I think Carter could be sort of a very valuable running back, getting, even if it's like 175 touches this season, could do enough as a receiver to kind of boost his fantasy value. Okay, let's shift over to some guys that are a little bit higher up on ADP lists. I think maybe pique your interest a little bit more, I would bet. One of those is Chase Edmonds, who I was surprised to see with the carry shares tool that he took a carry on just 19% of his snaps last season. Basically, nobody else on a fantasy radar was below 25%. It sort of paints a picture that Edmonds has been a James White style receiving back. Are you worried about that now with James Conner on the team in Arizona as well? Or do you think Edmonds can really kind of contribute both as a runner and receiver that would prop up his fantasy value a bit?
Yeah, he's another guy I'm not drafting. I have no interest in. So one of the big pieces I do every year is I comb through all the post-draft press conferences, the interviews with the coordinators, the coaches, the GMs, and I try and look for meaningful takeaways. And for whatever reason, I don't even think he was asked about the running backs, but Cliff Kingsbury, day 2 or day 3, volunteered that he saw James Conner as his Kenyon Drake, we want him to be our early down horse, and we want Chase Edmonds to basically have the same role he had last year. So, his ADP has skyrocketed in comparison to, the value he brought to fantasy teams last year. So I'm not projecting too much more work for him at all. if he hits, and he could hit in a big way, you'd really need James Conner to get hurt, which granted he's always hurt, but yeah, exactly. But yeah, I'm still not taking him at his ADP. I think Cliff just likes him in that role, and maybe a week or two with Connor out, he'll be a bell cow and he'll smash. But I'm not seeing too much more work for Edmonds this year.
Yeah, I'm in lockstep with you here. Edmonds is 25th in ADP among running backs on ESPN right now. Crazy. That's just way too high. I mean, you can get the Javonte Williams types that have like a real chance to be, at least by the end of the year, I think top type of running backs. I just don't really see that with Edmonds. The only thing I'll say in his favor is that while 210 pounds sounds very light, he is only 5'9". So like he's a little bit better built than his weight alone would indicate. So maybe he does have the upside to be, an every down back, but I'll believe it when I see it, given a lot of the camp talk has been about how like both of these players are the number one running back in their mind. So I'm not sure that there's a differentiation the way that you would want for a player that's going 25th at the position. So, I mean, kind of crazy. All right. This next guy, I can tell this is going to be the one that you're definitely interested in. DeAndre Swift of the Lions. Very interesting splits from weeks 1 to 8 and then weeks 9 to 17 last year. That first half, 43.2% snap share, 28.3% carry share. That latter number just 44th at the position. But for the second half of the season, that jumped up to 58.1% snap share and 57.9% carry share. So those are about even, plus the second number, 9th highest at the position. That kind of paints the picture that Swift could be, like a bell cow type of back, which would be hugely valuable given how effective he seems to be as a receiver. Do you see him that way? And does that make him like a top 10 type of fantasy asset in your mind?
Yeah. So I don't see him as a bell cow. I think he should be a bell cow. But I think, Anthony Lynn is a donkey, and all he's ever shown us is that he's a donkey. In February, he called Swift a 3-down back. And then in May, he talked about, I have my A back and I have my B back, and I'm going to use them both. And then in June, he said he's going to ride the hot hand. And it's just like not at all encouraging. I think this is going to be, unfortunately, frustratingly, a committee situation. I mean, I like Swift. I have him RB15 and he's RB15 and he's RB15 by ADP. Yeah. But he's also in my in a tier where I stop drafting running backs. I go RB to start. Then if I have a tier 3 running back who makes it to round 3, I'll definitely consider that. But he's round 4, so or he's tier 4, so sort of avoiding him again. I like him. I believe in the talent, but Jamal Williams is there. I don't trust the coaching staff. Luckily, he's definitely far more valuable than Jamal Williams because he is a competent pass catcher, or more than competent pass catcher. Saw at least 5 targets and 6 of his final 8 games. He averaged 16.5 fantasy points per game over that span. That's low end RB1 production. And it's like the Jets, this is a bottom 5 team, probably bottom 1 team. So they should be trailing early and often. There's not a lot of receivers there. You can feel good about. So you should get the ball quite a bit. And you're hoping for basically, I think, like Austin Eckler light, where he's, sort of a wide receiver masquerading as a running back and then also contributing on the ground.
So, I mean, I definitely agree with your point that I think Jamal Williams is going to be involved here. I think that kind of syncs up with Dan Campbell, the new head coach's kind of physical mentality that he hilariously always projects. But also, I think it might be really important for this team. So Jared Goff had the biggest splits between his passing DVOA when pressured and when clean last season of any quarterback. So I think he's really a quarterback that needs a clean pocket. And I think Williams may be the ticket to help him make that happen. But even with that said, Lynn, like you said too, with Eckler, Anthony Lynn facilitated Austin Eckler being the number 13 running back with 16.1 PPR points per game since 2018. So maybe even though Swift won't always be the primary guy in the backfield, maybe he does have that potential in a lower volume. Or do you think that Swift have a chance to maybe be on the field a little bit more with Jamal Williams and say the Packers are willing to use Williams with Jones at the same time? Because I mean, who on the Lions is going to catch the short passes? Goff isn't really going to scramble for first downs. They have Amon-Ra St. Brown, the mid-round rookie, as a potential slot option. But a lot of the receivers are Rashad Perriman, Tyrell Williams, deeper threat types. They may really need to rely on Swift as an outlet. I mean, they've got a good tight end, but I think they're going to need some guys to catch some short passes, right?
Yeah, I mean, Quintez Cephas is there too, and he's a player I thought was pretty underrated. He had that 110 target game in his in week 1 last year, but then didn't catch many of those and didn't do much the remainder of the season. But I agree. Again, you're hoping for Austin Eckler light, which is sort of Kamara light, although he's catching up to Kamara a little bit.
Yeah.
Again, at the end of the day, don't really hate him, but he's not a priority guy for me. Just I think his upside's capped with Jamal Williams there.
Yeah, so on the twitch.tv/FB Outsiders chats, Vanderpool mentions that Derrick Henry's numbers are insane on that graphic. Very true. He's true. That's pretty much true on whatever graphic you want to put up there. I have a guy here that can maybe kind of tracking a little bit that way towards that elite top 5 potential. Jonathan Taylor, kind of an interesting first half, second half split here as well. From weeks 1 to 10 last season, just a 43.2% snap share, 44.7% carry share in Indy. That was 25th highest to the position. But over the second half of the season, that jumped to 60.9 and 64.3%, 5th highest to the position. So do you think Taylor can kind of take that second half workload and make that the standard all season, which I think would justify a top 5 type of pick in fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, I think he could definitely repeat that volume, but I don't think that volume justifies a top 5 pick. That's not good volume at all. 61% of the team snaps, 64% of the carries. Like I have Joe Mixon projected at 79% of the snaps and 82% of the carries, something like that. So that's a committee workload, and you're not going to be drafting that top 5, nor should you. In real terms, what was that volume worth? He ranked 9th in fantasy points per game last year, but he ranked 19th in expected fantasy points per game. Like, granted, he's a great talent, but that's that really hints at a regression to the mean. Even though I do think he's already probably one of the most talented running backs in football and fantasy football. He also, over this stretch, had the second softest schedule of any running back. David Montgomery's was insanely soft, but Taylor's was right behind him. They were basically tied. Montgomery's schedule was worth a boost of about 4.4 fantasy points per game. And then Taylor's was worth a boost of 4.1 fantasy points per game. So basically, you want to know what Taylor's true numbers would be, a schedule agnostic. So over his final 6 games, just take off 4.1 fantasy points per game from his average. But at the same time, he has the overall softest schedule of any running back this year. So good news for him. But Marlon Mack's also returning, and the coaching staff there seems stubborn in their love for a committee approach. Nyheim Hines still stealing work in the passing game, which isn't good. It's going to make Jonathan Taylor very game script dependent, very week to week volatile, especially with Carson Wentz dinged up and injured. Dr. David Chow put the over under at week 6. So I think he's a great solid trade target when he's underwhelming week 4, week 5, week 6. You could trade for him. I'm not drafting him. Again, he's just an overpriced committee back. But yeah, maybe Indianapolis loses 4 of their first 6, whatever. And he's really struggling with that poor game script. Defense is loading the box against whatever backup quarterbacks under center, and you could buy low. That would be ideal.
So I'm interested by that opinion. So I'm obviously super worried about the short-term quarterback situation, which everybody should be, and what that might mean. Remember, good quarterback play is the key to carry attempts, honestly, because if you're down by multiple scores in all your games, then you're not going to be running the ball. But I will say that it did seem to me that Nyheim Hines' heavy usage probably also said a lot about Phillip Rivers as a player that is always willing to dump down and throw the ball to the running back. That's really not been Carson Wentz's game a lot through his career. So do you think that sort of committee that you're presenting, is that going to be the situation this year if you're playing with a totally different style of quarterback?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. Over the past 3 seasons, Rivers has targeted running backs 27.1% of the time, that ranked behind only Drew Brees. Carson Wentz ranked like 28th of 40th. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. It's sort of, is that just a role that the coaches want on the field? I mean, if he's not targeting running backs, like Nyheim Hines is just like running empty routes.
Or not on the field? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I still don't think that's a massive boost for Taylor. Like, ideally you have Taylor running those routes and getting those targets.
Yeah. So like, I think this next running back situation is kind of similar to what you presented the Colts. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about Antonio Gibson, who had 3.4 targets per game last season, but just a 9.8% target share, was 34th at the position between guys like Leonard Fournette and Josh Jacobs, players you don't think of as being sort of dual threat type of running backs. It's because J.D. McKissick, his teammate, 7.3 targets per game, first at the position, 20.4% target share, second at the position. Do you think that's going to change this year? Like, it seems like everyone's expecting a big growth from Gibson this season, but I'm worried that if McKissick remains involved, that's going to put a cap on what Gibson's providing through the air as a pass catcher.
Yeah, so I'm definitely predicting Gibson to make a major leap forward this year. A lot of beat writers are projecting the same. Our insider said he talked to the staff there and basically confirmed, they're going to be phasing out J.D. McKissick at least somewhat. I really think if he had stayed healthy, he'd be a player we're all drafting in like mid round 1, because we had Scott Turner say, I forget when it was, like early November. He said, yeah, the plan with Gibson, the plan all along was always with Gibson was to give him more and more work down the stretch. His role is going to continue to grow as the year goes on. And then so we saw that start to play out. In week 12, he saw season highs in snap share, carries. He saw 20 targets. He saw 7 fantasy points scored. He scored 37. And so massive week. And then what happened the next week? He got injured and he was never the same. He spent the entire rest of the season inactive or listed as questionable on the injury report. And so I think had he stayed healthy, we really would have seen this massive breakout, league winning stretch through the fantasy postseason. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but now we get him at a discount. And really the big question is, how much of McKissick's role do you take and give to Gibson? By my numbers, if he gets 80% of McKissick, he's Christian McCaffrey. If he's 50% of McKissick's targets, he's a top 3 fantasy running back. Just 30% of McKissick, he's still top 7. And so remember with this guy, this is a converted wide receiver. He had like 30 career carries in college. So the big question is, we know he's a good pass catcher. Can he, be a competent rusher? And like, boy, was he, he didn't have much experience in that role, but he was awesome in that role. He averaged 10.4 rushing fantasy points per game, that ranked 9th most, 4.7 yards per carry. And, coming out, the coaching staff talked about him as sort of their Christian McCaffrey. And, that's lofty praise, but I think it's an important comparison. Scott Turner, Coach McCaffrey. So just like massive bell cow potential. I think we're looking at like sophomore year David Johnson type upside for Gibson in 2021.
See, I'm definitely a lot more nervous about the situation than you are. And it's kind of coming from 2 places. One, you mentioned the injury last year, but I'll point out that he had 206 total touches last season. That was so much more than he's ever had in college. Like, did he even have 150 total touches in his career at Memphis? I'm not sure he did. I think we're
He
really
should have.
I'm not saying he doesn't have the talent to. Like, from an efficiency standpoint, he was awesome last year in the NFL. Like, hard to do better than that, especially as a rookie. But it's asking a lot for him to suddenly be putting up 275 touches, the type of volume you would want to see in the NFL for a player that really has that type of Christian McCaffrey workload. The second thing I'll point out too is that the Washington quarterbacks last season were like incredibly willing to throw the ball to the running backs. Number one being Alex Smith, who far and away led the league, as he always does, in running back target rate. I wonder if, yes, Gibson is going to take over some of McKissick's, target share, but will the overall running back target share maybe be cut in half with Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback, a player that has been much more willing in his career to throw the ball downfield? Plus, you're adding a lot of new receiving weapons, including Curtis Samuel, who, again, has some of that, like, from the backfield type of potential. Like, I'm really worried that Gibson may not shoot up in the receiving game the way that many expect. Like, do you think either of those fears holds any water?
Well, again, just give him 30% of JD McKissick's targets, and he's a top 7 fantasy running back by volume. And he was, I don't know, RB like 20 volume and finished like RB 15, whatever. So hyper efficient. Can he withstand heavy volume? I mean, he's a Jonathan Taylor clone. Like, just pull up his combine numbers next to Jonathan Taylor's combine numbers, and they're basically the same player. So I feel comfortable, given his size, that he can withstand a heavy workload, though we haven't seen it. I think that's a good point, that, Ryan Fitzpatrick certainly isn't as conservative as Alex Smith. But at the same time, I expect the offense to be far better than it was last year. And that should help. He's locked into that workhorse rushing workload. And so game script matters quite a bit there. More red zone drives with the offense being better. And so, even if there is a dip in target volume, I think he's going to be on the field more, see more snaps at McKissick's expense to make up for that. And then better efficiency overall and better, more red zone volume, things like that to make up for that.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. We got two more backs to talk about, again, from a receiving perspective to close out the show. First off, Austin Eckler, 6.5 targets per game last year, was third highest, but obviously dealt with some injuries again. I'm wondering what you think about his fantasy potential this year, given that Justin Herbert has really exceeded expectations. And if you project any kind of development into year 2 of his career, or maybe one of the leading quarterbacks in football, is that going to really shoot Eckler up the board to where he maybe could even threaten, number 1 player in fantasy potential, or maybe top 5 in PPR?
Yeah. So I don't know how much, Justin Herbert's ascension matters to me. I think, certainly the offense, if it takes a step forward, that's good news for Eckler. I mean, I don't see him getting very many rushing touchdowns, but, at least maybe some receiving touchdowns. The more first downs you convert, the more volume or whatever. The big concern for me with Eckler is Joe Lombardi, the offensive coordinator there. I mean, granted, he's coming from New Orleans, and he's compared him to Alvin Kamara. So, Eckler's always been like Kamara light, or, very close to it. So ideally it's the same, but he also compared him to Reggie Bush and Darren Sproles. Underutilized Darren Sproles when he was there in New Orleans, at least as a runner. He averages 4.3 carries per game under Lombardi. And then Bush was like severely underutilized. He averaged 15.9 carries with Detroit in 2013. And then that fell to 6.9 the next year when Lombardi came over. And there's just like other weird things as well. Reports out of camp that Larry Roundtree and Justin Jackson and Joshua Kelly are all seeing a lot of first team rushing work. And you can say, well, okay, those guys don't have their jobs on lock. Eckler has his job on lock. So, get them those reps. And Lombardi in Detroit, had like a really gross 3-way committee. I don't know. Maybe I'm just like digging too deep, but yeah, at the end of the day, Eckler is Alvin Kamara light. on a really good offense. He's that sort of like scat back on steroids where he's going to put up like borderline low end RB1 or low end wide receiver 3 fantasy numbers as a receiver, then, high end RB2 rushing production. So it's like sort of a cheat code.
Yeah, absolutely fair. Okay, then one more player to talk about, Giovanni Bernard, now with the Buccaneers. So LaShawn McCoy saw a target on 17% of his snaps last season. That was one of the leaders at the position, trailing just Nyheim Hines, James White, and J.D. McKissick. But McCoy performed very poorly by efficiency numbers at Football Outsiders. I think was probably just kind of past his prime. I don't know, was he 33 or so years old last year? Bernard still seemingly in his prime, joining the team. My favorite stat is that Bernard has 8 drops the last 3 seasons, and Leonard Fournette had 9 drops last year alone, including the playoffs, but still. So it's like you had 2 kind of primary ground guys in Fournette and Ronald Jones, neither of whom can catch the ball at all. And you bring in this very effective pass catcher. Like, how is that going to shake up the Bucs backfield? And does it make Bernard a sleeper, or does it just sort of, affect your opinions about Fournette or Jones if it does?
Yeah, I don't know that the pass catching back in a 3-way committee is too enticing to me. So I'm probably not drafting Giovanni Bernard. Also, I think there was a report weeks ago that said like right now he's the backup, and I don't know what that means, but it just seemed like him being the scat back isn't at all a lock at this point in time. I think Leonard Fournette could have been intriguing as one of those like high upside dead zone RB plays. Just look at the postseason last year. He averaged 16 carries, 5.3 targets, 21.7 fantasy points per game. He was playing on 74% of the team's snaps. He's, RB 35 by ADP. And the argument you want to make is, well, he was the bell cow 2 years ago. He was a bell cow last year when it mattered most. So and he was great in that role. So why shouldn't he just keep that role? But yeah, you bring in more competition. It makes it less likely for Leonard Fournette to hit, I guess. So yeah, I'm not drafting Gio, and probably not drafting Fournette, but because Bernard's existence makes him a little less intriguing.
Yeah. Well, Scott, I really appreciated the insight. I thought this was a very interesting conversation. Tell all of our viewers and listeners where they can catch out all of your work at Fantasy Points or otherwise.
Yeah, you can subscribe to my website, fantasypoints.com. Use promo code 21 Barrett 10 to get 10% off your subscription. We have John Hansen, the fantasy guru himself, Graham Barfield, Adam Kaplan, our NFL insider, Greg Cassell, the tape GOAT, Joe Dolan, Tom Brawley handles betting. Check us out. And that's it.
Absolutely. I encourage everyone to. They have some great content. Scott and really the whole team does a fantastic job. Then for everybody watching or listening to us, thanks so much. Please check us out for the rest of this off season every Tuesday and every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern time on twitch.tv/FB Outsiders. Aaron will bring the main show in this Thursday, the FO Radio Hour. And please subscribe and rate us at the Football Outsiders podcast network on the podcast app of your choosing. Thanks so much, and we will catch you next time.